Tonight's lecture is over plant and fungi diversification. And our learning objectives for this lecture include to be able to define what a plant is and discuss the benefits of a vascular system. We will also be able to describe the structure of a seed and how the evolution of the seed allowed gymnosperms to dominate. Then we will discuss why angiosperms are the dominant species today and explain how angiosperms improve seeds with double fertilization. Then we will be able to explain the benefits and costs of fruits. Then we will characterize the structure of a typical fungus and explain ways in which fungi may interact with other species. An animal can move from place to place to get food or water, to avoid being eaten, or to find a mate. It's harder for a plant. It must do all the things an animal does, obtain food and water, protect itself from predators, and reproduce, but a plant can't move a centimeter in the process. Wherever a seed puts down roots, that's where the plant stays anchored for its entire life. Immobility is one aspect of being a plant. A plant is a multicellular eukaryote that produces its own food by carrying out photosynthesis and has an embryo that develops within the protected environment of the female parent. Plants occur almost exclusively on land, and they vary in size from less than 0.04 inches, about 1 millimeter, to 380 feet, about 116 millimeters tall. There are a few exceptions to our definition of a plant, but it applies to the vast majority of all approximately 400,000 known species of plants on Earth today. The closest relatives of land plants are multicellular photosynthetic eukaryotes that include many species of algae, such as seaweed. These organisms differ from plants, however, in that they live only in water or on very moist land surfaces. In sharp contrast, plants can live in a wide range of habitats from moist places to deserts. So, most plants can make their own food, carbohydrates, by photosynthesis. But a plant also needs nitrogen to build proteins, phosphorus to make ATP, and salts to create concentration gradients between the inside and outside of cells. Plants use roots, the part of the plant below ground, to obtain these needed substances from the soil. Above ground, plants have a shoot that consists of a stem and leaves. The stem is the structure that supports the main photosynthetic organ of a plant, its leaves. When we think of plants, we often think of them as chlorophyll containing. In reality, some plants have very little or even no chlorophyll. Their ancestors had chlorophyll, which is why they are classified as plants, but the descendant plants lost almost all chlorophyll over evolutionary time, and they can't carry out photosynthesis. Instead, they live as parasites that steal nutrients from other plants. Dodder is an example of a parasitic plant that almost completely lacks chlorophyll and gets its sugar from the host plant it grows on. You may have seen dodder growing on plants in a nearby vacant lot or at the side of a road. So plants that carry out photosynthesis need sunlight. This creates a challenge for plants that grow under tree canopy, with just a few sunny spots where light penetrates the tree branches overhead. If a seed sprouts or germinates in the shade, the young plant needs to somehow get to the nearest sunny spot. Plants can do that by growing toward the light. You may have seen a quote-unquote lucky bamboo plant, it's not really bamboo, which can grow in spirals or loops. The growers move the light source every few days, forcing the plant to bend to follow the light. If you buy lucky bamboo, you must continue rotating the light source, or it will start to grow straight like any other plant. Sex can also be a challenge for an organism that is anchored in place by its roots. One way that plants have met this challenge is by having full haploid and diploid life stages. We will see how the independent haploid stage allows the male and female gametes from immobile and sometimes widely separated plants to meet for reproduction. Additionally, some plants enlist the help of animals to carry the male gamete to the female gamete. Resisting predators is another challenge for organisms that cannot move, but plants have ways to defend themselves. Thorns, for example, are an anatomical defense that plants use to avoid predation. Plants also use chemicals to deter predators, as many people learn when they develop an itchy rash from poison ivy. So the earliest land plants were the first multicellular organisms to live on land. They were non-vascular, meaning that they had no tube-like vessels to transport water and nutrients. The subsequent evolution of land plants involved a series of radiations of forms with characteristics that made them increasingly independent of water. And that brings us to our take-home message for section 14.1. Plants are multicellular organisms that spend most of their lives anchored in one place by their roots. Characteristics evolved that made it possible for plants to successfully obtain food, reproduce, and protect themselves from predation on land despite their immobility. Moving on, the aquatic ancestors of land plants were a group of protists called green algae. Like the land plants, green algae are multicellular photosynthetic eukaryotes, but they live only in water or on very moist land surfaces. As water dwellers, green algae do not require specialized structures to obtain water and nutrients. Water simply enters the cells by osmosis, and the nutrients they require are present in solution in the water that surrounds them. Taxonomists consider some green algae that look like slime on rocks, which are organisms called coleochaetes, to be the closest relatives of plants. As an individual coleochaete is about the size of a pinhead and is only one cell layer thick, coleochaetes can withstand exposure to air, allowing them to survive when the water level in a lake falls and leaves them high and dry. This resistance to drying out was the first evolutionary step as plants moved from water to land. Then, about 472 million years ago, the first land plants appeared as patches of low-growing green stems at the water's edge. They had no roots, leaves, or flowers, but they were an enormously important source of food for land organisms. As land plants emerged from water, they faced the same two challenges that would confront the first terrestrial animals some 25 million years later, supporting themselves against the pull of gravity and retaining moisture. The earliest plants did not have to grow upward, they could creep along the ground. But the second of these two challenges was more urgent. They did have to avoid drying out. Growing close to the ground, as mouses do today, allowed them to take advantage of groundwater both for reducing desiccation and for moving their gametes. Additionally, all land plants are protected from drying out by a shiny, waxy layer on the stem and leaves called the cuticle. And that brings us to our take-home message for section 14.2. The first land plants were small, had no leaves, roots, or flowers, and could grow at the water's edge. Nonetheless, they set the stage for the enormous diversity of terrestrial plants and animals on Earth today. Moving on, the earliest land plants were low-growing for a reason. They had no structures that could transport water and nutrients from the soil upward into the plant. The only way that these substances could move within the plant was by slowly diffusing from one cell into an adjacent cell. Despite these limitations of diffusion, three groups of plants, liverworts, hornworts, and mosses, known as the bryophytes, still use diffusion to move substances through their bodies rather than having any sort of quote-unquote circulatory system. So, more than 12,000 species of mosses grow in habitats extending from the Arctic and alpine regions to the tropics. Liverworts and hornworts are small, less than an inch in height, simple plants that grow in moist and shady places and resembled flattened moss. The bryophytes are referred to as quote-unquote non-vascular because they do not have vessels to transport water and food. Projections that penetrate just a few micrometers into the soil absorb water and nutrients into the outermost layer of the cells. Because these projections are so short, non-vascular plants must either live in places where the soil is always moist or become dormant when the soil surface dries out. To adapt to land, the non-vascular plants had to develop a method of reproduction that protected the plant embryo from drying out and provided it with a source of nutrients. A life cycle of alternating haploid and diploid generations made this possible. In animals, the haploid gametes at fertilization produce a new diploid cell that becomes a multicellular organism. In the adult stage, this organism starts the process all over. In contrast, plants exhibit an alternation of generations. So the life cycle of a moss plant provides a useful example of how the alternation of generations works. When you look at a spongy mass of moss or any other non-vascular plant, what you see is the haploid or gametophyte part of the life cycle, rather than the diploid or sporophyte part of the life cycle. For this reason, mosses are described as having a dominant gametophyte. The adult moss plants are haploid plants, that is, all cells have only one set of chromosomes. There are male and female moss plants, which have male or female reproductive structures located at the tips of the stems. Water collects here during rainstorms, allowing the sperm to swim or to be splashed from the male structures to fertilize eggs in the female structures. Once an egg is fertilized, a diploid zygote is formed within the female structure and divides to become an embryo. The embryo is sheltered within a female reproductive structure, which provides it with water and nutrients. Eventually, the female structure elongates to such a degree that it breaks into two and forms a capsule extending over the top of the plant like a raised fist. Inside a capsule are hundreds of haploid spores, that is, single cells containing DNA, RNA, and a few proteins. When a capsule ruptures, spores that land in moist, sheltered spots grow into new haploid male or female moss plants. So some non-vascular plants are economically or ecologically important, particularly the mosses. Peat forms in waterlogged habitats where decomposed mosses and other bog plants accumulate in soft, spongy, cold wetlands. Because oxygen moves 10,000 times more slowly in water than in air, peat bogs contain very little oxygen. Thus, when mosses and other plants die, aerobic microbes aren't available to decompose them. Instead of being broken down, the dead plant matter accumulates as peat. This process has important environmental consequences. When decomposing plant matter is broken down by bacteria, carbon is released into the atmosphere. But when peat accumulates instead, the carbon is trapped, keeping it out of the atmosphere. The bog acts like a giant carbon sponge. Peat bogs cover only 3% of the Earth's surface, but they store twice as much carbon as all the trees in the world's forests. Draining swamps for agriculture and other human activities causes peat to dry out. Microbes can then decompose it rapidly, producing CO2 in the process. The result is the release of carbon that has been trapped for hundreds or even thousands of years into the atmosphere, exacerbating climate change. In 2019, these carbon emissions equaled 10% of the global annual fossil fuel emissions. In the United States and around the world, efforts are increasing to re-wet drained peat bogs, creating carbon farms. In places with monsoon seasons, such as Malaysia and Indonesia, peat bogs also play an important role in flood control because they absorb about 20 times their weight in water and release it over a period of months. And in some parts of the world, peat is burned to heat homes and stoke the fires used in various manufacturing processes. So, as unlikely as it seems, non-vascular plants can actually grow in deserts. And mosses, along with lichens and cyanobacteria, are important components of the biological crust that holds desert soils in place. The crust cements the soil particles together and allows the soil to resist wind erosion, but this crust is extremely fragile and very slow to regenerate. When people or cattle walk over the crust, they break it into small pieces that cannot resist wind. Then erosion can strip a meter or more of soil in a few decades, leaving tree trunks supported in midair by their roots. And that brings us to our take-home message for section 14.3. Non-vascular plants, including mosses, lack roots and vessels to move water and nutrients from the soil into and throughout the plant, and they reproduce with spores. Moving on, what a difference some tubes can make. That's all vascular tissue is, an infrastructure of tubes that begins in a plant's roots and extends up its stem and out of the tips of its leaves. The evolution of vascular tissue allowed early land plants to transport water and nutrients faster and more effectively than does the cell-to-cell diffusion employed in non-vascular plants. The roots of vascular plants penetrate far enough into the soil to reach moisture even when the soil surface is dry. Roots that reach deep into the soil also provide the support that a plant needs to grow upward without falling over. This is why vascular plants can grow taller than non-vascular plants and are more successful in areas where the surface of the ground dries out between rains. Ferns are the most familiar of the primitive vascular plants. During the Carboniferous period, which extended from 360 to 300 million years ago, ferns were a major component of the huge swamp forests that eventually formed the coal deposits we now mine. A related group of plants, the horsetails, like their Carboniferous ancestors, grow in wet habitats where the oxygen concentration around the roots is low because the spaces between soil particles are filled with water rather than air. Horsetails developed hollow stems that allow oxygen from the air to diffuse down to the roots. The thin leaves of the horsetails have a single nutrient and water-carrying vessel extending from the base to the tip. Simply having vessels, as horsetails do, is an important evolutionary innovation, but ferns have gone a step further. In addition to the central vessel in each leaflet, the leaves of ferns have vessels branching from the central vessel to the edges of the leaflet. This arrangement places a channel for the movement of water and nutrients close to each cell in the leaf. So like non-vascular plants, horsetails and most ferns reproduce with spores. In horsetails, the central hollow stem is topped by a conical structure where the haploid spores are produced and released. Many ferns have sporangia on the undersides of the leaves where the spores are produced. Because the haploid gametophyte is much smaller and simpler than the diploid sporophyte, ferns are described as having a dominant sporophyte. Horsetails and ferns are taller than non-vascular plants, so their spores can be blown by the wind when they are released, and they may settle some distance from the parent plant. This increased dispersal ability was an important adaptation. Non-vascular plants are so low-growing that wind can't play much of a role in moving their spores. A spore that lands on moist soil grows into a tiny, heart-shaped structure called a prothallus, which is a free-living haploid stage of a fern. The prothallus produces the haploid gametes. Some cells produce eggs and others produce sperm. A sperm swims through drops of rainwater to fertilize an egg, and the fertilized egg, a diploid zygote with 2 sets of chromosomes, grows into an adult fern. And that brings us to our take-home message for section 14.4. Vessels are an effective circulatory system to carry water and nutrients up from the soil to a plant's leaves. The first vascular plants, including the earliest ferns and horsetails, were able to grow much taller than their non-vascular predecessors. Moving on, as we've seen, the evolutionary development of vascular tissue allowed plants to grow larger. Vascular plants could colonize areas where the soil at the surface of the ground was not always wet, but their roots could penetrate the soil to reach water and nutrients. The next big innovation in plant evolution was the seed, an embryonic plant with its own supply of water and nutrients encased within a protective coating. Unlike spores, which are single cells that contain only DNA, RNA, and a few proteins, seeds contain both a multicellular embryo and a store of nutrients, mostly starch. The nutritive tissue, called endosperm, in flowering plants and trees, can fuel the seed's initial growth. A seedling draws energy from the endosperm while it extends leaves upward to begin photosynthesis and its roots downward to reach water and nutrients in the soil. Two modern groups of seed-producing plants exist: gymnosperms, including pines, firs, and redwoods, and angiosperms, which include all flowering plants and trees. Like plants that do not produce seeds, seed plants have a life stage called the gametophyte that produces haploid gametes, that is, the sperm and the egg. This is analogous to humans' production of haploid gametes. Because the gametophyte is much smaller than the sporophyte in seed plants, these plants are considered sporophyte dominant. Pollen grains and ovules are the male and female gametophytes, respectively, of seed plants. In brief, a haploid female gamete, or an egg, forms inside the ovule. When a pollen grain lands near the ovule, it produces a tube that grows into the ovule. Sperm from the pollen grain move through the pollen tube into an ovule and fertilize the egg. The external layer of the ovule then forms the seed coat. And that brings us to our take-home message for section 14.5. Seeds are a way that plants can give their offspring a good start in life. A seed contains a multicellular embryo plus a store of carbohydrate and other nutrients. Moving on, all of the 900 or more species of gymnosperms are seed-bearing plants that produce ovules on the edge of a cone-like structure. During the middle of the Mesozoic era, about 160 million years ago, the forests that dinosaurs walked through consisted entirely of gymnosperms, that is, pine trees, redwoods, cycads, and their relatives. Flowering plants, angiosperms, did not appear for another 35 million years. Indeed, when it comes to population size and habitat range, pine trees and their relatives are among the most evolutionarily successful groups of plants on Earth, growing on every continent except Antarctica and extending from sea level to the tree line on the mountains. Pines, spruces, firs, redwoods, and their relatives are familiar to the residents of a temperate region. Many of these conifers have needle-like leaves, but that is not true of all gymnosperms. The ginkgo has distinctive fan-shaped leaves, and cycads have a palm-like frond with many small leaflets. Both are nearly identical to fossils from the Mesozoic era. So the reproductive structures of gymnosperms, the cones, are either male or female. The pine cones you are probably familiar with are the female cones, which produce the ovules and eventually the seeds. The male cones are smaller and release pollen that is blown by the wind, and some of it reaches the ovules, which lie beneath the protruding scales of the female cones. The quantity of pollen released by conifers is beyond imagination. Pollen-heavy air in a pine forest becomes hazy, and every surface is coated with yellow. Wind dispersal is clearly an inefficient method of pollination, that is, getting the pollen to the vicinity of the ovule. Indeed, billions of pollen grains are wasted for each grain that lands on a female cone and produces sperm to fertilize an egg in an ovule. Nonetheless, this brute force method of ensuring fertilization works. For more than 200 million years, pines have been successfully pollinated by wind. So, when the pollen arrives at the female cone, a pollen tube forms and transports the haploid sperm to the ovule, where fertilization occurs and a haploid embryo begins to grow. The embryo develops slowly within the female cone over the course of many months until the scales of the cone open and release the seed, which is then ready to sprout into a new plant. With the evolution of seeds, gymnosperms developed a life cycle with no free-living haploid stage such as we see in the non-vascular plants. This evolutionary change in life history probably reflects the different degrees of evolutionary fitness of haploid versus diploid organisms. A haploid organism has just one copy of each chromosome, which means it has one copy of each allele. If the haploid organism carries a defective allele for a critically important gene, the organism is doomed because it has only that single defective version of the gene. In contrast, diploid organisms have two sets of chromosomes and thus two copies of each allele. If one copy is defective, the second copy can function as a backup so that mutations are much less likely to be lethal for diploid organisms than for haploid organisms. And that brings us to our take-home message for section 14.6. Gymnosperms were the earliest plants to produce seeds. This mode of reproduction offered advantages over the spores of earlier plants and gave gymnosperms the boost that they needed to become the dominant plants of the early and middle Mesozoic era. Gymnosperms depend on wind to carry their pollen. Moving on, in addition to having the widest geographic range and the greatest number of species among the gymnosperms, the cone-bearing trees, the conifers, include both the tallest and the oldest living organisms on Earth. The tallest living tree in the world is a coast redwood that is 380 feet, that's 116 meters tall. Another conifer, a Douglas fir that is no longer standing, measured 413 feet or a whopping 126 meters. Miniature species of conifers exist too. The shore pine, for example, can be just 20 centimeters tall. Also, the oldest tree trunk belongs to the Great Basin bristlecone pine, the Methuselah tree, which has lived for more than 4,800 years. A slightly older tree was cut down in 1964. There is more to a tree than its trunk, though, and trunks can be replaced. That is what a Norway spruce in Sweden has done. The current trunk is about 600 years old, but the roots are 9,550 years old. This tree has persisted by sending up a new trunk each time the old one died. Structural characteristics of trees allow them to grow large and live to great ages. Rigidity is provided primarily by heartwood, which is a core of dead tissue that contains complexly cross-linked molecules. The outer layers of the tree trunk and its branches are bark, dead tissue that can be shed without damage to the tree and that protects the living tissue from attack by plant-eating insects. The ability of conifers to defend themselves by exuding a sticky pine pitch that can engulf and smother insects is also a part of their success. And that brings us to our take-home message for section 14.7. Conifers have more species and a larger geographic range than the rest of the gymnosperms combined. Rigidity, an exterior layer of bark, and the ability to exude sticky pitch protect conifers, allowing them to grow taller and live longer than any other plants. Moving on, the appearance of flowering plants, the angiosperms, happened about 135 million years ago in the Cretaceous period, and that set the stage for the botanical world we know today with flowering trees, flowering bushes, and all the grasses and herbaceous non-woody plants we see around us. The vast majority of plants on Earth, including most of the important food crops, are flowering plants in the angiosperm group. This group includes some 350,000 known species compared with approximately 1,000 known species of gymnosperms. So flowers come in a bewildering variety of sizes, shapes, and colors, but all have similar structures. A supporting stem with modified leaves, the fleshy petals, and the sepals, which form a usually green wrapping that encloses the flower while it is in bud. Most angiosperms combine the male and female reproductive structures in the same flower. The male structure is the stamen. It includes the anther, which produces pollen, and its supporting stalk, called the filament. The female reproductive structure is the carpel. It has an enclosed ovary at its base, which contains one or more ovules in which eggs develop, a stalk called a style, and this extends from the ovary and the sticky tip of the stigma. Pollination in angiosperms involves the transfer of pollen from the male reproductive structures to the female reproductive structures of a flower, sometimes the same flower and sometimes a different flower, on the same plant or on a different plant. Pollination is a multi-step process in which a pollen grain sticks to the stigma and forms a tube that grows until it reaches the ovule, thus producing a route for sperm to travel to fertilize the egg. Although most flowers can contain both male and female structures, several thousand species of plants produce flowers that are only male or only female. Sometimes male and female flowers are born on different individual plants. In quite a few angiosperm species, however, the same plant has some male flowers and some female flowers, often side by side. Maize or corn is a familiar plant with male and female flowers in different places on the same plant, although you might not recognize the reproductive structures as flowers. The tassel at the top of the plants is the male flower, and the ear is formed by female flowers. The rapid development, as far as we can judge, of all the higher plants within recent geological times is an abominable mystery. Charles Darwin, 1879, in a letter to Joseph Hooker, director of England's Royal Botanic Gardens. And that brings us to our take-home message for section 14.8. Flowering plants appeared about 135 million years ago and diversified rapidly to become the dominant plants in the modern world. A flower houses a plant's reproductive structures. Most flowers have both male and female reproductive structures. Moving on, picture a flower. What does it look like? Flowers vary widely, and we all have our favorites. The label flower would seem to indicate little beyond the fact that flowers are usually brightly colored, frequently have a predominant scent, and generally sit at the end of a plant's branches. With very few exceptions, all flowers have the same four fundamental structures: sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels. However, their outward variation is important in sexual reproduction. Fertilization occurs when the male gamete merges with the female gamete, but that's a lot easier said than done. First, the male gamete must travel to the female gamete. This voyage is pollination, the journey of a pollen grain to the stigma. A small number of angiosperms achieve pollination by releasing tremendous amounts of pollen into the wind, as do the gymnosperms, or into water, banking on the slim chance that some pollen will land on the female reproductive organs of another plant of the same species. So, most angiosperms rely on a different approach to move pollen from their anthers of one flower to the stigma of another. They use animals to carry it. To ensure that animals will visit a flower and thus pick up and deliver their pollen cargo, two strategies for achieving pollination have evolved among flowering plants. One is bribery. The plant bribes some animals to carry its pollen from one plant to another by offering something of a value to the animal. For this mutually beneficial method, a mutualism, to work, the plant must produce a sticky pollen and a flower that catches the attention of the pollinator, and, most important, something of value to the pollinator, such as a nutritious nectar rich in sugars and amino acids, or perhaps a safe, hospitable location for an insect to lay its eggs. Second is trickery. The plant deceives some animals into carrying its pollen from one plant to another. Some orchid species, for example, produce flowers that resemble female longhorn bees. The mimicry is so good that male bees mount the flower in an attempt to mate with it. The male bee twirls wildly on the flower, like a cowboy on a bucking bronco, repeatedly whacking its head against the strategically located anthers and getting pollen stuck all over his head and body. That is not enough for the plant to achieve pollination, but it's a start. If that male bee gets fooled again by another orchid flower and mounts it to mate, he will inadvertently deposit some of the pollen from his body onto the strategically placed stigma of that flower. In the end, the bee does not gain from his actions, but the orchids have an effective system of pollination. So, just as flower structures exhibit tremendous variety, so do pollinators. Pollinators include birds, mostly hummingbirds, bees, flies, beetles, butterflies, moths, and even some mammals, mostly bats. In each case, there has been strong coevolution between the plants and their pollinators. The plants become increasingly effective at attracting the pollinators and deterring other species from visiting the flower, while the pollinators become increasingly effective at exploiting the resources offered by the plants. Because of this strong coevolution between plant and animal species, for most flowers, we can determine, just by examining the flower's features, the type of animal that will pollinate it. And that brings us to our take-home message for section 14.9. Angiosperms rely on animals to carry pollen from the anthers of one flower to the stigma of another. With their flowers, plants can bribe or trick animals into transporting male gametes to female gametes where fertilization can occur. Moving on, fertilization is the fusion of two gametes to form a zygote. It begins when a pollen grain lands on a stigma of a flower, but that is far from the end. In angiosperms, the process is called double fertilization because there are two separate fusions of male nuclei, each carrying a complete set of the parent organism's genetic material from the pollen grain with the female nuclei in an ovule. Double fertilization is a more efficient system than the type of fertilization in gymnosperms because whenever and only when an embryo is produced at fertilization, so too is a more substantial ready-made food source. So once the pollen grain arrives on the female stigma, the pollen grain forms a tube that extends downward through the stigma and style to the ovary, ultimately entering the ovule. As the pollen tube grows, two haploid sperm are formed within it by mitosis, and both move down the pollen tube. When the pollen tube is growing, a cell within the ovule undergoes meiosis, forming 4 haploid cells called spores. 3 of these spores usually degenerate. The surviving haploid spore enlarges and undergoes mitosis, forming an embryo sac. A large central cell in the embryo sac has 2 haploid nuclei. One of the other cells in the embryo sac is the haploid female gamete, or the egg. The pollen tube will be guided into the ovule by 2 other haploid cells within the embryo sac. When the pollen tube reaches the ovule, one of the 2 sperm fuses with the egg to form a zygote. The other sperm fuses with 2 nuclei in the middle of the embryo sac to form the endosperm, which has 3 sets of chromosomes, or in other words, it's triploid. The process is called double fertilization because 2 sperm enter the ovule and combine with female cells in 2 separate events, forming 1. A zygote with 2 sets of chromosomes, and 2. An endosperm with 3 sets of chromosomes. In the final steps of seed production, the diploid zygote undergoes multiple mitotic divisions to form an embryo, while the triploid cells multiply mitotically to produce the endosperm that will provide nutritional support for the seedling during its initial growth stages. The outer layers of the ovule form the seed coat that will protect the seed until it sprouts. The enclosure of the seed within the ovary is a key distinction between angiosperms and gymnosperms. The seeds of a gymnosperm are not enclosed and are sometimes referred to as quote-unquote naked. So in gymnosperms, a single sperm fuses with an egg to form a zygote in an ovule that contains hundreds of other female cells, which are used as a source of nutrients for the resulting embryo. However, in angiosperms, double fertilization offers 2 important advantages. 1. Double fertilization initiates formation of endosperms only when an egg is fertilized. Angiosperms do not waste energy forming endosperm in ovules that will not contain embryos. Gymnosperms invest that energy up front, and nutrients in ovules that are not fertilized are wasted because those quote-unquote seeds do not contain an embryo. Secondly, angiosperms can produce smaller gametes because the large energetic reserves that will be produced only after fertilization occurs. The small size of the male and female gametes of angiosperms ensures that seeds are produced quickly. So let's look at figure 14.22 on page 429 of your book. This figure shows how, as different reproductive strategies have evolved in plants, their gametes have become progressively smaller. Rapid production of seeds allows angiosperms to grow as annual plants, that is, plants that complete their life cycle from sprouting from seed production in one growing season, which is something gymnosperms cannot do. Outbreeding, the combination of haploid cells from 2 different individuals produces offspring with greater genetic diversity, that is, carrying a greater diversity of alleles than offspring that result from interbreeding, the combination of male and female gamete from the same individual. Angiosperms have a variety of ways to increase their chances of outbreeding. When male and female reproductive structures are located in different flowers or even on different individuals, for example, this increases the chance that a pollen grain landing on a stigma will come from a different plant. But many flowers with both male and female parts also have mechanisms to prevent self-fertilization. For example, anthers may mature before the stigma, so the stigma is not ready to receive pollen when the anthers are active. And when the stigma does become functional, the anthers are no longer producing pollen. Other plants use a molecular recognition system to prevent interbreeding. Proteins on the surface of the stigma will not allow pollen from the same individual to form a pollen tube. And that brings us to our take-home message for section 14.10. Angiosperms undergo double fertilization, which ensures that a plant does not invest energy in forming endosperm for an ovule that has not been fertilized. Moving on. What would happen if all the fertilized eggs and all the developed offspring resulting from those eggs remained on the female plant or nearby if they fall off the parent plant? Well, parent and offspring would end up competing for the same light, space, soil nutrients, and other resources. The solution to this survival dilemma that has evolved in angiosperms is the fruit, a structure that aids in dispersing the plant's seeds. The pea pods, sunflower seeds, corn kernels, and hazelnuts are a few examples of fruit. These are dry fruits, and the seeds they contain are transported by wind, water, or animals. Many other angiosperms make fleshy fruits that consist of the ovary plus some additional parts of the flower. For example, the core of an apple is the ovary, and the flesh of the apple is derived from adjacent parts of the flower. Blueberries, watermelons, oranges, tomatoes, and peaches are other examples of fleshy fruits. The fruit usually develops from the ovary and sometimes from nearby tissue right around the seeds which develop from the ovules. Given that the ovary is part of a flower, after pollination and fertilization, that flower will turn into a fruit. The fleshy part of a fruit is often larger than the ovary, and as a result, an angiosperm invests a lot of energy into producing fleshy fruits. The payoff comes when an animal eats the fruit and then defecates the seeds at a location far from the parent plant. In other words, fleshy fruit is the bait that some flowering plants use to get animals to disperse their seeds. So when you look at fruits, you see several characteristics that help this system work. 1. Fruits are colorful. Red is the most common color, followed by yellow and orange. Bright colors contrast with green foliage and make fruits conspicuous. 2. Fruits typically taste good. Plants pour sugars into fruits, and their sweetness appeals to many animals. 3. Fruit is good for animals, serving as a significant source of sugar and enabling animals to produce ATP for their needs. Additionally, fruit has other nutritional value. Many birds incorporate the red and yellow pigments into their own color patterns, and colorful male birds are appealing to female birds. Thus, male birds that eat fruit are likely to produce a lot of offspring who also eat fruit, and this is good for the plant. To germinate, seeds must pass through the animal's digestive tract and survive. This is not a problem. Seeds survive being eaten by animals. In fact, some seeds will not germinate unless they are eaten by animals and then defecated. For some plants, the pulp that surrounds the seeds and the fruit inhibits germination, and it must be digested away before the seed will sprout. The seeds of other plants have chemicals in the seed coats that must be removed by the acidity of an animal's stomach before the seeds will germinate. And there's another plus to this system. The seeds are deposited within a bit of manure that provides nutrients for the seedlings. And that brings us to our take-home message for section 14.11. Fruits are made from the ovary and occasionally some surrounding tissue. Plants often rely on animals to disperse their fruits, which contain the fertilized seeds. The seeds are deposited at a new location where the seedlings can grow. Moving on, the interactions of plants and animals are not simple. On the one hand, plants depend on animals to pollinate their flowers and disperse their seeds. On the other hand, many kinds of animals eat plants, and plants are vulnerable because they can't run away. Plants, however, are not defenseless. A host of devices have evolved in plants that give them some protection against being eaten. These defenses fall into two categories: anatomical structures such as thorns and chemical compounds, including hallucinogens. So spines, prickles, and thorns are structures that discourage herbivores, and some are impressively large. The acacias, a group of plants that grow as large bushes or small trees, are notoriously spiny. The different effects of acacia spines are sometimes enhanced by ants that live in the swollen bases of the spines and fight off other animals, from insects to mammals, including humans, that would feed on their host. Spines on palm fronds carry bacteria that infect spine-inflicted wounds, providing a long-lasting reminder to avoid palm fronds. In most plants, the surfaces of leaves and stems have microscopic hair-like structures that protect the plant against insect herbivores by exuding a sticky fluid trap. Stinging plants, such as the nettles, use larger hair-like structures to inject a potent fluid into any animal that brushes against a leaf. Many chemical defenses make plants bitter or otherwise unpalatable, but some plants produce potent chemicals that affect animals' nervous systems. Local weeds, which grow throughout the western North America region, contain alkaloids that cause permanent damage to the nervous system. When cattle and horses eat local weed, they tire quickly and stop eating. Other defensive chemicals are hallucinogens. THC in the leaves and buds of marijuana plants disorients animals and causes them to stop eating. So many of the chemicals that plants produce to protect themselves have physiological effects in humans, and in turn, many have been used for medicinal purposes. The Aboriginal peoples of North America and Eurasia, for example, knew that extracts of willow or aspen bark could relieve pain. Salicin is a compound in the bark that relieves pain, and we still use acetylsalicylic acid or aspirin for pain relief. Opium poppies produce a more powerful pain reliever. Foxglove flowers contain a compound that slows the heart rate, and a compound from the ipecac plant, from which the syrup of ipecac is derived, can induce vomiting. Plants with medicinal uses are much sought after, and representatives of pharmaceutical companies trudge through rainforests and deserts to find them, a process called bioprospecting. The rewards, the medicinal as well as financial, from such a discovery can be very lucrative. There's another role that chemicals can play in a plant's defense systems. Although plants can't move, they do send messages. For example, they release airborne chemicals that can warn nearby plants of an impending insect threat or call insects to their aid. When insects nibble on plants, the plants release the chemical methyl jasmonate, which drifts on the breeze to nearby plants. The drifting methyl jasmonate causes plants to ramp up production of their own defensive chemicals so they are prepared if the insects invade them. Meanwhile, insects that consume other insects are attracted to the plants emitting the methyl jasmonate because it signals the presence of prey. When corn and cotton plants are attacked by caterpillars, the release of methyl jasmonate summons parasitic wasps that deposit their eggs inside the caterpillars. When the eggs hatch, the wasp larvae eat the caterpillars from the inside out. So about 900 species of plants, those living in soils deficient in nitrogen, turn the tables. They eat insects. These plants use the protein in their insect meals to supplement the nitrogen compounds they get from the soil. Insectivorous plants are most common in boggy areas because boggy soil often has low nitrogen concentrations. Pitcher plants are an example. Their name comes from their conspicuous pitcher-shaped structures that capture insects. It's easy for an insect to enter the top of the pitcher plant, but hard to get out because the inner walls are lined with hair-like structures that point downward, forcing the insect into a pool of liquid. Some pitcher plants merely absorb the nitrogen that is released when the trapped insects decay, but other species secrete digestive enzymes into the pool. These enzymes, which are basically the same as the enzymes in your stomach, digest the insects and make the nitrogen available more rapidly. And that brings us to our take-home message for section 14.12. Plants have a wide range of defenses against herbivorous animals, from physical defenses such as thorns to chemicals that have complex effects on the animal's physiology. Plants respond to insect attack by synthesizing chemicals that make the plant less palatable. Moving on, fungi make up their own monophyletic kingdom within the eukarya domain. Most fungi are multicellular sessile decomposers or detrivores. Although they were originally thought to be plants lacking chlorophyll, it turns out that fungi have little in common with plants. In fact, DNA sequence comparisons reveal that fungi are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. As eukaryotes, fungi have all the basic cellular components you would expect to find: nuclei, mitochondria, an endomembrane system, and a cytoskeleton. They also have cell walls, but those cell walls, instead of including cellulose as in plants, are made of the carbohydrate chitin, a chemical also important in producing the exoskeleton of insects. Fungi most likely arose from a unicellular, flagellated aquatic protist more than 500 million years ago, and possibly as long as 1.3 billion years ago. Close to 100,000 known species of fungi have been described, but the total number of species is estimated to be about 1.5 million. These species are divided into about 7 phyla, but the overall phylogenetic classification is still very much in flux, with many of the relationships unresolved. Molecular evidence is increasingly guiding this process. So the most commonly encountered fungi are 1. The mushrooms of the phylum Basidiomycota, 2. The yeasts, which are the only single-celled fungi. These include truffles and morels of the phylum Ascomycota. And 3. The molds, which is not a phylogenetic grouping. Molds such as Penicillium is the source of the antibiotic penicillin of the phylum Ascomycota, and the black bread mold of the monophyletic phylum Zygomycota, which produces visible black spores on the bread's surface and extends long chains of cells into the bread. Bread rises because yeast cells are mixed into the dough, which is then kept in a warm space until the yeast consumes the sugar and produces carbon dioxide through fermentation. The carbon dioxide released by the yeast makes the dough swell into a loaf. And that brings us to our take-home message for section 14.3. Fungi are eukaryotes with the same internal cellular elements as other eukaryotes, and one distinctive feature, a cell wall formed from the carbohydrate chitin. Moving on, most fungi are multicellular and are composed of long strings of barely visible thread-like strings called hyphae cells. The hyphae interconnect to form a mass of tissue called a mycelium, the form in which a fungus spends most of its time, usually underground or in a decaying tree or log. So the structure that most people associate with fungi is the mushroom, but a mushroom is just a temporary reproductive structure or fruiting body that is part of a complex reproductive cycle that includes both sexual and asexual reproduction in some fungi. Figure 1429 on page 435 outlines the complex reproductive cycle of fungi. This consists of several steps, which starts underground. In this step, distinct haploid hyphae fuse to form dikaryotic hyphae in which single cells have 2 distinct nuclei. Second, the dikaryotic hyphal state can last for years, as the dikaryotic mycelium spreads via mitosis throughout an area. Third, at some point, a reproductive structure, the mushroom, forms. It is produced from tightly packed dikaryotic hyphae. Fourth, in some cells within the mushroom, the haploid nuclei in dikaryotic hyphae fuse, becoming diploid. Then, the diploid cells within the mushroom undergo meiosis, producing haploid spores. Finally, when the spores land in a hospitable place, they start growing by mitosis as haploid hyphae, and the cycle is complete. So fungi have an unusual and effective method of getting nutrition. They digest their food outside their body, while growing underground, hyphae secrete enzymes that break down the organic molecules around them, and the hyphae then absorb the nutrient-rich fluid. They are extremely effective at absorbing nutrients and growing. In fact, in eastern Oregon, a yellow honey mushroom fungus covers an area of about 4 square miles, nearly 10 square kilometers. This fungus is estimated to be at least 2,400 years old, and it may be more than 8,000 years old, which could make it the oldest living organism. Moreover, by area, it is the largest. But huge as it is, the fungus is hard to detect because the mycelium is underground. The fungus appears to be on the surface only as mushrooms that are edible but not particularly tasty, and as hyphae in dying and dead trees. The discovery of this enormous fungus occurred in the year 2000 when Oregon foresters sought an explanation for an epidemic of dead and dying trees in the Malheur National Forest. They discovered that the fungus was killing the trees by causing their roots to rot. As decomposers, fungi play an enormously important ecological role in speeding the decay of organic material in forests. All they need for their nutrient supply is some sort of organic material that they can break down. They don't need light, so they can grow underground or inside of dead trees and logs. So besides being able to live off of dying trees, fungi can grow in and on people. Mycosis is a general term for any disease caused by a fungus, such as athlete's foot or the related fungi that cause jock itch, beard itch, scalp itch, ringworm, and toenail fungus. These fungi digest some of the organic molecules of your body, and because they are spread by spores, these fungal diseases are quite contagious. The fungi can linger on moist surfaces and on clothing and towels, so they tend to be a problem in places like shared showers of dormitories and fitness centers. Fungi can also thrive in poorly ventilated spaces and buildings. Molds are multicellular fungi, and many can be toxic at high concentrations, causing numerous harmful effects. People exposed to a quote-unquote sick building can experience burning or watering eyes, a runny nose, and itchy skin. These are allergic reactions to proteins and fungal spores. Most severe effects, such as cancers and miscarriages, are probably produced by toxins released when the fruiting bodies of the fungi disintegrate. Curing a sick building can be so expensive that in some cases the entire building is destroyed and rebuilt instead. However, fungi aren't all bad. Take the fungus that produces penicillin. In 1928, researcher Alexander Fleming stacked some of his used petri dishes containing bacterial colonies in a corner of his lab. When he returned after a month-long vacation, he found that some of the dishes had been contaminated by a fungus. He noticed that near the fungal infections, the bacterial colonies were dead, while farther away from it, they continued to grow. Suspecting that the fungus might be producing something toxic to the bacteria, Fleming cultured it and discovered that it produced a substance that killed many different types of bacteria. He named the fungus penicillium, following other researchers' development of a method to purify the antibacterial compound produced by the fungus. Penicillin became a quote-unquote wonder drug responsible for saving millions of lives by helping to treat bacterial infections. Other examples of beneficial fungi are gastronomic delicacies. Commercially grown portobello and shiitake mushrooms, for example, command high prices. Truffles, the underground reproductive structure of a particular group of fungi, can sell for as much as $3,500 a pound. Because truffles grow underground, there is nothing on the surface to indicate their presence, but truffle hunters can use trained pigs or dogs to locate them by scent. And that brings us to our take-home message for section 14.14. Fungi are decomposers, and to thrive, they need organic material to consume in a moist environment so their hyphae don't dry out. Parts of the fungus that are most often visible are its temporary spore-producing bodies. Fungi can cause a variety of health problems, but also are responsible for antibacterial medicines such as penicillin. Moving on, if you examine the roots of a plant with a microscope, you will find round structures and fibers closely associated with the fine rootlets and root hairs. These are root fungi, also called mycorrhizae. Some mycorrhizae have hyphae that press closely against the walls of root hair cells. Others send hyphae through the root cell walls and into the space in between the cell wall and the plasma membrane. So the association between mycorrhizal fungi and plants is beneficial to both partners. Mycorrhizal fungus benefits by drawing sugar from the plant, which it uses to support its own cellular respiration. The plant benefits because the fungus extracts phosphorus and nitrogen from the soil and releases them inside of the plant's roots, allowing it to grow faster and larger. Some plants manipulate mycorrhizae to gain a competitive advantage over other plants. Garlic mustard, for example, was brought to North America by European colonists to add a tangy flavor to salads. Initially, it was planted in kitchen gardens, but it escaped into the wild where it thrives as an invasive species. Garlic mustard excretes compounds from its roots that interfere with the partnership between mycorrhizal fungi and local native plants. Because the native plants require mycorrhizal fungi to prosper, the destruction of these fungi by garlic mustard weakens the plants. This chemical warfare is so successful that garlic mustard has wiped out entire populations of native woodland plants and is threatening many forests in the central United States. So fungi may also form mutually beneficial relationships with chlorophyll-containing bacteria and/or algae. These two-way or three-way partnerships, called lichens, grow on surfaces such as tree trunks and rocks. The fungus is fed by its photosynthetic partner and helps it absorb water and nutrients. In addition, the fungus provides nutrients for its partners by excreting enzymes that dissolve organic material and excreting acid that dissolves rock, which is important in soil formation. And the take-home message from section 14.15, plants and fungi have a close and mutually beneficial association with mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizal fungi grow in intimate association with the roots of most plants, receiving sugar from the plant and transferring nitrogen and phosphorus to the plant.